The debt collector will be back in the morning. If you don't pay, he'll take the shop. He'll take the shop, and my little sister will have nowhere to live. The guy behind the counter must be scared to death, but he's smiling because yesterday he paid off debts like this before breakfast, in another world, in another body. Now, let's take it step by step. The first thing Daniel feels is lentils. Tiny, hard grains dig into his cheek and smell musty. He opens his eyes. A wooden ceiling, brown streaks, mold, burnt oil, a stranger's body. He takes a deeper breath and a pain shoots through his ribs so sharp that his vision goes dark. Someone is crying nearby. A thin voice repeats a single word. Brother, brother. Wake up. Daniel turns his head. Standing over him is a girl of about 16 in a patched-up apron. Her thin fingers are clutching his shirt. Her eyes are red and swollen. She has been crying for so long that she is no longer sobbing, but simply shaking. And then a barrier bursts in Daniel's mind. 2 lives poured out at once. In one, he's sitting in front of 3 monitors, drinking his 4th coffee of the night. In the other, he's standing behind the counter of this very shop, counting out coins with trembling hands. Dane So, the eldest son of a bankrupt merchant from Little Harbor. Yesterday, the debt collector came. He struck once. Dane fell and never got up again. Now Daniel So lies in his place, 29 years old, a former quantum analyst, dead on I-95 somewhere in another universe. The lentils are real. The girl is real. The pain in his ribs is absolutely real. Daniel sits down. His head is spinning so much he almost falls back. But the girl, Leah, his sister, no, Dane's sister. She looks at him as if he's returned from the dead. Technically, he has. He hugs her. She flinches. Then she clings to him with both hands and cries for real. Sob after sob, like a child who's finally been found. Daniel holds her and scans the room over his shoulder. Bags of flour. One is torn. A cracked scale on the counter. Half-empty shelves. A piece of paper on the table by the wall. He knows what it is even before he reads it. An IOU. The Guild of Halldors. He squints and reads the number. And smiles. In New York, he used to close out positions like this before breakfast. And then it flashes before his eyes. A translucent panel hovers right in front of his face. A single line. Access to the vault. 1 gold bar. 1 second. Daniel blinks. The panel doesn't disappear. Leah doesn't see it. He carefully reaches out with his mind to the line. And a weight appears in his palm. A smooth gold bar. No hallmark, no coat of arms, not a single mark, just gold, pure and warm. 1 second, 1 bar. He hides his hand behind his back before Leah looks up. His brain is already working. 7 years on Wall Street have taught him to think faster than to panic. Endless gold. It sounds like a victory. But Daniel knows better than anyone. Endless gold isn't wealth. It's inflation in its purest form. If he dumps a ton of bars on the market tomorrow, prices will crash. They'll hang him like a counterfeiter. And the bars have no hallmark and no history. Any guild appraiser would pick up 2 of these and realize they aren't natural metal. No traces of smelting, no impurities, no legend of origin. Every bar must be laundered through a real transaction. Sell a product, provide a service, win a deal. Only then does the gold become real in the eyes of this world. A safe isn't wealth. A safe is an endless obligation to work. Daniel hides the ingot in his pocket and pushes Leah away. She wipes her face with her sleeve. Her eyes are red, but her gaze is already sharp. She asks if he's all right. He nods. She says they need to think it over. Leah frowns. There's no time to think. The collector will be back in the morning. If they don't pay, he'll take the shop. He'll take the shop, and they'll have nowhere to live. Daniel looks at the receipt, then at Leah, then at the empty shelves, back at the receipt. He asks how many shops on their street owe the Haldo. Leah is surprised. Almost all of them. The baker Torin owes for flour. The widow Maris owes for rent. The blacksmith Olden owes for coal. The furrier Ham doesn't even leave the house. He's afraid of the collectors. Daniel nods slowly. 5 debtors isn't a problem. 5 debtors is a network. He stands up. His legs are unsteady. Dane's body is thin and weak. 18 years old. Malnutrition. Beatings. This body has known neither a gym nor a proper meal. Daniel takes 3 steps toward the table and nearly falls. Leah catches him by the arm. He leans on the table and looks at the cracked scales. One pan hangs crooked. The weights are tarnished. But the mechanism works. A good symbol to start with. He tells Leah to get some sleep. She replies that she won't sleep until she understands what he has in mind. He looks at her intently. In Dane's memory, Leah is quiet and obedient. But a quiet, obedient girl doesn't run the books for a bankrupt shop all by herself at 16. Beneath the silence lies a core of strength. Daniel sees it. He says that in the morning, when the collector comes, she must remain silent. Not a word, no matter what he says, no matter what happens. Leah presses her lips together. She asks why. The collector is used to intimidating people. It's his tool. Silence breaks the tool. Leah looks at him for a long time. She says her brother never spoke like that. Something tightens inside Daniel. He lives in a stranger's body. He accepts love that isn't meant for him. Leah is waiting for her brother, but standing before her is a stranger in a familiar shell. He replies that the blow to the head cleared his thoughts. Leah doesn't believe him. He can see that, but she nods and goes upstairs. Daniel is left alone. It's night outside the window. The street smells of fish and smoke. A dog barks somewhere. He sits down on the floor, leans his back against the counter. He takes out a bar and rolls it between his fingers. Heavy, smooth, faceless. 1 bar per second. 86,400 a day. He closes his eyes and counts. Not gold. Gold is infinite and therefore useless in and of itself. He's counting something else. How much a bag of flour costs in Veenkor. How much in Yeshen. The price difference. The shipping margin. Warehouse rent. The percentage of losses on the road. He doesn't know the exact figures yet, but the structure is familiar. Commodity arbitrage. He'd been doing this for 7 years, only instead of oil and soybeans, now it's salt and spices. Instead of Bloomberg, the memory of a dead boy. Instead of a hedge funds, a shop with cracked scales. Daniel opens his eyes, hides the ingot, and waits for morning. Morning comes with a knock on the door. Heavy. Confident. The knock of a man who knows the door will open because there is no choice. Leah comes down the stairs, pale. Daniel is already standing behind the counter. He nods at her. She stands against the wall and clenches her hands. The door opens. The collector is exactly as Daniel imagined him. Broad-shouldered, short neck, a baton on his belt. The smile of a man who's already broken someone's finger today, and the day's only getting better because of it. His name is Grat. He walks in without asking, looks around, sees the empty shelves and smirks. Says he's come for the money, or for the shop, or for the girl. It makes no difference to him. Leah flinches. Daniel doesn't move. He looks at Grat calmly. Grat frowns. Yesterday, this kid went down with a single blow. Today, he stands straight and looks as if he's appraising livestock at the market. Grat takes a step forward. Daniel pulls a bar of gold from under the counter. He places it on the table. The sound is heavy and dull. Gold on wood. Grat freezes. His eyes are wide. A single standard bar is worth 3 times the So family's entire debt. Daniel speaks, quietly, steadily. He isn't paying off the debt. He's buying it out, along with the debts of the 4 other shops on this street. Here's a down payment. The documents will be drawn up at the notary's in an hour. Grat blinks. His mouth opens and closes. He's used to tears, to pleas, to haggling, not to calm voices and gold bars. He asks where the gold came from. Daniel replies that it's none of his business. His job is to pass the offer on to the higher-ups. The terms are favorable. The Haldors consider these debts uncollectible. Buying them out with gold is a gift. Grat looks at the bar, then at Daniel, then back at the bar. He takes the gold and leaves. He doesn't say goodbye. He doesn't smirk. Leah stands against the wall, holding her breath. The door closes, and she whispers where he got the bar. Daniel says later, "Right now, to the notary." An hour later, in a small office at the intersection, he signs 5 documents. The So family's debt, Baker Toran's debt, Widow Maris's debt, Blacksmith Olden's debt, Furrier Ham's debt. The Haldors are giving up the papers for next to nothing. To them, it's trash. For Daniel, it's a network. 5 families, 5 connections, 5 people who will wake up tomorrow and find out they owe not the fearsome guild, but the quiet young man from the corner shop. Daniel stacks the copies neatly. Leah walks beside him in silence. She looks at him as if seeing him for the first time. Halfway home, she says her brother never knew how to haggle. Not even for fish at the market. Daniel says nothing. A stone of guilt shifts in his chest, heavy and smooth, like a bar of gold. So's shop looked like a place that had been slowly dying for the past 3 years. Daniel stood in the middle of the sales floor and counted. Not money, problems. Bags of flour stood along the wall. 4 whole ones, 2 torn. Flour on the floor mixed with dust and lentils. The shelves on the left were empty. The shelves on the right held some kind of grain in clay pots. 3 of the 7 pots were cracked. The scales on the counter were crooked. The weights were rusted. There were no price tags at all. Daniel ran his finger along the counter and looked at the gray streak on his skin. He turned to Leah. She was standing in the doorway, waiting. He asked where the ledgers were. Leah silently went upstairs and returned with a notebook. Thin, worn. The cheap leather cover was bound with twine. Daniel opened it. Columns of numbers written in neat, childlike handwriting. Not a single mistake. He checked 3 times. Every number was in place. Every total added up. Leah kept these records alone, without an education, without help, simply because someone had to. Daniel closed the notebook and said she needed a new one, a bigger one. Leah asked why. He replied that the old one would run out in a week. Leah looked at him with an expression Daniel was beginning to recognize, a mixture of anxiety and hope. She didn't understand what was happening to her brother, but she liked the results more than the fear. At that moment, a man emerged from the back room. Short, stooped, gray sideburns, and an apron that had been white about 20 years ago. Mr. Barrow, the old foreman. He had served even before Dane's father. Dane's memory told him that Barrow had always been there. Silent, reliable, a bit grumpy. Now he stood in the doorway and looked at Daniel the way an old dog looks at a stranger who sat down in the master's chair. Barrow said he'd heard about the notary. The whole neighborhood had heard. The kid, So, had suddenly paid off 5 debts with a gold bar. People say all sorts of things. Daniel asked what exactly they were saying. Barrow replied that some say he stole it. Others say he sold out to the Haldors. Still others say he found a treasure. Daniel nodded. He said, "Let them talk. In a month, they'll be saying something else." Barrow didn't answer, but his eyes narrowed. He looked at Daniel like a man who can analyze as well as any analyst. He just analyzes differently. He was counting the inconsistencies. Yesterday, the boy Dane couldn't string two words together when the collector came. Today, he stands up straight, speaks clearly, and uses words Dane never knew. Barrow remembered that. Daniel saw it. The first thing Daniel did that morning was take inventory. He asked Leah to take notes while he went through every corner of the shop. Every sack, every pot, every shelf. He weighed the goods on the uncalibrated scales, adjusting for the pan's deviation. He sniffed the flour and grains to check their freshness. He tapped the walls for signs of dampness. Leah took notes in silence. Barrow watched from the corner. 2 hours later, Daniel had the full picture. So's shop sold flour, grains, lentils, dried herbs, and small kitchenware. The markup was 0 or negative on half the items. Torrent, the baker 3 doors down, didn't buy his flour here, but from a wholesaler on the other side of town. That's because Dane didn't know how to negotiate a volume discount. The flour from the wholesaler was 20% cheaper. Daniel told Leah that starting today, every item would have a price tag. Leah asked what a price tag was. Daniel explained, "A small sign next to the item. It shows the price. The customer sees the price before asking. No need to haggle. No need to ask. No need to worry about being cheated. The price is the same for everyone." Leah looked at him as if he'd suggested stopping the rain. She said, "Nobody does that." Daniel replied that was exactly why they'd be the first. Barrow snorted from the corner. Daniel heard him. The second thing he did was implement a return policy. In Orelon, such a concept didn't exist. If you bought it, you bought it. Daniel wrote out the rule by hand and pinned it to the wall. If the merchandise was damaged or didn't match the description, the buyer could return it within 3 days and get a full refund. Leah read it and said they'd go broke. Daniel replied that they were already broke. It couldn't get any worse, and trust was worth more than flour. She didn't understand, but she wrote it down. By noon, the first neighbor arrived, Baker Torrin, a heavy-set man with sunburned hands and a flour smudge on his cheek. He stumbled into the shop looking as if he were on his way to a funeral. He said he'd heard, that his debt was now with Daniel, and that he'd come to find out the terms. There was so much weary fear in his voice that Daniel fell silent for a second. Then he said there were no terms, or rather, there was one. Torrin would buy flour here, at So's shop, at a fixed price with a quality guarantee. No interest on the debt, no deadlines. Torrin would pay it back when he could. Torrin stood there in silence. Then he asked what the catch was. Daniel replied that the catch was that the flour would be fresh. Torrin didn't laugh, but the tension in his shoulders eased slightly. He left without saying goodbye. Half an hour later, he returned and bought a bag of flour, in silence. Leah wrote out the first price tag. Her hands were shaking, but the numbers were neat. After Torrin, the widow Maris came in, an elderly woman in a dark headscarf. She was already crying at the door. Daniel came out from behind the counter and sat her down on a chair. He gave her some water. He waited. She said she couldn't pay, that she had nothing, that her daughter was sick. Daniel asked what she did for a living. Maris replied that she did laundry for the tavern in the square. But the tavern keeper had been delaying payment for 2 months already. Daniel nodded. He said the debt wasn't going anywhere. Let her do the laundry. Let her work. When the tavern keeper pays, then they'll sort it out. In the meantime, let her daughter come into the shop. Leah will give her lentils and dried herbs, no charge, on credit for the future. Maris looked at him as if he'd said something in a foreign language. Then she silently got up and left. Leah asked quietly why he was giving away goods for free. Daniel replied that it wasn't free. It's an investment. Maris does laundry. The innkeeper owes her. If Daniel resolves the issue with the innkeeper, Maris will be the first person on this street to tell the neighbors that So's shop can be trusted. And the trust of a single laundress is worth 10 sacks of lentils. Leah was silent for a long time. Then she said that her brother hadn't used to think that way. The stone in her chest shifted again. Daniel turned away toward the shelves and began arranging the pots. By evening, 2 more people had visited the shop. The blacksmith, Olden, young, angry. He walked in with his fists clenched. He said he wasn't going to bow to the new owner. Daniel replied that there was no need to bow. He needed a blacksmith to make a damper for the furnace, for a fair price. Olden fell silent. He looked at Daniel. He asked what size. Daniel told him. Olden left. Then Ham the furrier. He didn't come himself. He sent a note through his son. The note contained one word. How much? Daniel wrote back. Not a penny. Come talk to me. Ham didn't come, but he didn't throw the note away either. That night, Daniel sat at the table by candlelight and did the math. He'd spent 1 bar of gold. He'd need to spend 2 more on fresh flour and grain. Every bar of gold had to be put to work in a real transaction, so it gains a history. You can't just pull gold out of thin air. Smooth, unmarked bars are a death sentence. So here's the plan. He takes a bar. He goes to the market. He buys goods from a wholesaler for cash metal. The wholesaler remelts the bar and stamps it with his mark. The bar gets a history. The goods go to the shop. It's sold at a markup. The money comes back clean. Slowly. Tediously. But safely. 1 bar per second. He can afford to be patient. Beryl went upstairs an hour ago, but Daniel heard a floorboard creak by his door. The old man wasn't asleep. The old man was watching. Daniel blew out the candle and lay down on the mattress. Dane's body ached from head to toe. His ribs were on fire. The bruise on his temple throbbed. He closed his eyes and saw the kitchen in Queens. His mother was sitting at the table, drinking tea from a white mug with a crack in it. She wasn't looking at him. She was just sitting there. And that was the worst part. For the first week, Daniel slept 4 hours a day and woke up every morning with the same thought. This isn't a dream. His body ached. The lentils were running out. The world was real. By the 3rd day, he had worked out a route. In the morning, before dawn, he would take 3 bars out of the safe and hide them in a canvas bag under his shirt. Then he would walk to the Viencourt Central Market. It was a 40-minute walk through the winding streets. The market opened with the first bell, and by that time, the wholesalers were already laying out their goods. Daniel bought flour from a merchant named Graham, an elderly, portly man with shrewd eyes. Graham had been selling flour for 30 years, and during that time had learned to judge a buyer by his gait. When Daniel first placed the ingot in front of him, Graham froze. Then he took the ingot, turned it over in his fingers, and held it up to the light. He asked where it was from. Daniel replied that it was an inheritance. Graham didn't believe him. But the gold was real. He weighed it on his scales, bit the edge, scratched it with his fingernail. Standard weight, pure metal, no hallmark. Graham asked why there was no hallmark. Daniel replied that it was old metal, from the days when a hallmark wasn't yet mandatory. Graham snorted, but he sold the flour, and he remelted the bar that very same day. Now it was a bar bearing Graham's hallmark, with a history, with a legend. Pure. Daniel repeated this process every morning. 3 ingots, 3 sacks of flour. back to the shop. By 9 in the morning, the goods were on the shelves. By the end of the first week, So's shop looked different. The shelves were full, price tags on every item. The floor was washed. The scales were calibrated. Barrow fixed the doorbell and hung up a new sign. Leah kept track of everything in a new notebook that Daniel had bought at the market, a thick one with sturdy pages. Leah held it the way other girls hold birthday presents. Customers began to take notice. Not right away. At first, they peeked in out of curiosity. Rumors of a gold bar and paid-off debts spread through Little Harbor faster than Daniel had expected. People came to look at the strange boy So. They stayed because they saw price tags. No one in Little Harbor had ever seen price tags. Trade in Orlon was built on haggling. Every purchase is a little war. The seller names a price twice as high. The buyer offers half that. 20 minutes of shouting, and both walk away unhappy. Daniel eliminated the shouting. There was one price for everyone. You didn't have to haggle. You could just take it and pay. For people who had spent their whole lives afraid of being cheated, it was like a sip of water in the desert. Torrent the baker now bought his flour only at So's shop So. Every morning, 2 sacks, no haggling. He would come, pay, pick it up, and leave. The whole process took 3 minutes. It used to take an hour. Torrent told his wife that he now spent that hour baking. Torrent's wife told her neighbor. The neighbor told the laundress. The laundress told the widow Maris. By the end of the week, people from the neighboring streets were coming to the shop. On the 6th day, something important happened. Daniel was standing behind the counter when a young woman walked in. She was short. Her dark hair was tucked under a simple scarf. Her hands were red from needles. She stopped at the threshold and looked around the shop the way one looks around an unfamiliar house, cautiously, ready to leave. She said she needed fabric. Daniel replied that they didn't sell fabric. She nodded and turned toward the exit. Daniel asked what she needed the fabric for. She stopped. She said she sews dresses. Daniel asked what kind. She replied that they were ordinary ones, for her neighbors. Daniel asked why she had come here specifically if she knew there was no fabric here. She was silent. Then she said quietly that she had heard they didn't cheat people here, that there were price tags here. She wanted to find out if that was true. Because in her life, there had never been price tags. Not on fabric, not on food, not at her job. Her name was Yuna Kim. She was 22 years old. She sewed so well that people recognized her dresses on the street. But she sold them for pennies because she didn't know how to name a price and blushed at the very mention of the word. Daniel asked her to wait. He went upstairs. He took a bar of gold from a hiding place. He came back down. He gave Leah a note with the address of a fabric shop in the Central Market. He told her to buy 3 yards of good quality cloth. Leah looked at him, then at Yuna, then back at him. She took the note and left. Daniel offered Yuna a seat. She sat on the edge of the chair, as if she were about to fly away at the first loud noise. He asked how much she charged for a dress. Yuna named her price. Daniel's expression didn't change, but inside, something tugged at him. That price didn't cover the cost of the fabric. Yuna was working at a loss and didn't know it. He asked how many hours it took to make one dress. Yuna said 8, sometimes 10. Daniel took a pen and paper. He wrote it down in a column. Cost of fabric, cost of thread, cost of needles, tool wear and tear, time rental. 10 hours of work at a rate that even a dock worker gets paid. Total. He turned the paper toward Yuna. She read it. Then she read it again. Her face went pale. She said that was 4 times what she charged. Daniel nodded. He said her dresses were worth more than she thought, and that he could prove it. Yuna was silent. Her hands lay on her knees, red from the needles. Strong, skilled, hands that created beauty every day and were paid less than the material was worth. She asked how he could prove it. Daniel replied that, for starters, she needed to sew 3 dresses from good fabric, not that cheap junk they sell at Malaya Priston, made of real cloth. And on the hem of each dress, she had to embroider a small letter. Yuna looked up at him. She didn't understand. Daniel explained. A designer's mark, a master's mark. When a blacksmith makes a sword, he puts his mark on it. When a potter makes a jug, he puts his mark on it. Why shouldn't a seamstress? Yuna said that a seamstress isn't a blacksmith. Daniel replied that a blacksmith works with his hands too. The only difference is that no one ever told the blacksmith that his work was just a nice hobby. Yuna shuddered. She stood up. She said she'd think about it, and she left quickly. She almost ran. Leah returned an hour later with 3 pieces of fabric. She asked who that girl was. Daniel replied that she was their first brand. Leah didn't understand the word, but she wrote it down. Barrow stood in the doorway of the back room and said nothing. That evening, Daniel found a small bundle under the door to his room. Inside was fresh bread, torn. No note, no words, just bread, warm. Daniel sat on the mattress and ate the bread in the dark. He thought of Torin, who had spent his spare hour baking, about Yuna, who had run away because for the first time in her life, someone had told her that her work had value, about Maris, who had sent her daughter for lentils, and the daughter had said thank you so quietly that Leah had to ask her to repeat it 3 times, about Barrow, who had seen everything and said nothing, and about Leah, who kept track of everything in clumsy columns without a single mistake, who now held her new notebook like a weapon, who looked at him with an expression he was afraid to decipher, because if it was love, it wasn't meant for him, but for the boy who died on that floor, in lentils, alone, not making it to morning. Daniel finished his bread, blowed out the candle, and decided that in the morning he'd talk to the innkeeper who owed Maris's widow money. The innkeeper's name was Hogan. He ran the place on Little Harbor Square, the only spot in the neighborhood where you could get a hot bowl of soup without getting sick. Hogan wasn't evil. He was worse. He was lazy and cowardly. He held back Maris's payment not because he didn't have the money, but because he knew she wouldn't complain. Who would she complain to? A widow with no connections, no protection, no voice. Daniel came to see him in the morning. Hogan was sitting behind the bar, polishing a mug. Fat, mustached, small, shifty eyes. He saw Daniel and tensed up. The rumors had reached him too. Daniel sat down across from him. He ordered tea. Hogan served it. His hands trembled slightly. Daniel sipped his tea slowly. Then he said he had a proposal. Hogan asked what it was. Daniel replied that Maris was doing his laundry. 2 months without payment. It was a debt. But Daniel hadn't come to demand payment. He'd come to make an offer. Maris would keep doing the laundry. Hogan pays her on time, every week. And in return, Daniel will supply the tavern with fresh flour for baking at a fixed price. Below market price. Hogan narrowed his eyes. He asked what the catch was. Daniel smiled. He said the catch was that Torn would bake the flour into bread. Torn supplies the bread to the tavern. Hogan sells the bread to the patrons. Everyone makes money. Maris gets paid. The circle is complete. Hogan was silent for a minute, 2. Then he said he agreed. But he wanted a bigger discount on the flour. Daniel shook his head. He said the price was fixed for everyone. Hogan opened his mouth to haggle. He looked Daniel in the eye. He closed his mouth. He nodded. They shook hands. When Daniel walked out of the tavern, he let out a sigh of relief. It was small, tiny, a chain of 4 people. The flour goes from Daniel to Torin. Torin bakes bread for Hogan. Hogan pays Maris for laundry. Maris buys lentils from Daniel. A circle. A closed cash flow. In economics, this is called the multiplier effect. A single gold bar passing through 4 hands creates value 4 times its weight. On Wall Street, they teach this in the first year. At Malaya Pristan, no one knew this. Daniel was walking back to the shop, counting in his head. 5 debtors, 1 innkeeper, 1 seamstress, 7 connections. From 7 connections, you can map out 12 exchange routes. From 12 routes, you can build a sustainable microeconomy on a single street. He stopped in the middle of the road. Some kid ran into his knee and ran on. Daniel didn't even notice. He was thinking. The problem was scale. Malaya Pristan was 30 houses, maybe 40, a few hundred people. That wasn't enough. To create a real market, you needed demand from outside the neighborhood. And for that, you needed a product that no one else had. Yuna's dresses. The thought came to him on its own, and Daniel smiled. A financier from New York, building a business strategy around a seamstress in a medieval shop. The world definitely had a sense of humor. He returned to the shop. Leah was sitting behind the counter, serving a customer. Calmly, clearly. She quoted the price on the tag. She took the money. She wrote it down in her notebook. The customer left with a look of mild surprise. She wasn't used to shopping without a haggle. Daniel stood next to Leah and looked at the notebook. The columns were neater, the handwriting more confident. Leah caught his gaze and blushed slightly. He said she had beautiful handwriting. She shrugged and said her mother had taught her. Then she fell silent. Her mother had died a year and a half ago. Her father 3 months after her. Daniel knew this from Dane's memories. Illness, deaths, despair. A common story for Little Harbor. He put his hand on her shoulder. She didn't pull away, but she didn't look at him either. She just kept writing. A week after the inventory, a rhythm settled into the shop. In the morning, Daniel went to the market. In the afternoon, he sold goods. In the evening, he did the accounts. Leah kept the books. Barrow served customers and grumbled about everything. But the shelves were full. Customers came. Money came back. Slowly, drop by drop. But it came. On the 10th day, Daniel decided it was time. He gathered all 5 debtors in the shop after closing. Torin arrived first. He sat on a sack of flour and folded his arms. Widow Maris came with her daughter. She sat quietly in the corner. Blacksmith Olden leaned against the wall and didn't take off his gloves. Furrier Ham came last, small, nervous, shifty eyes. He hadn't left the house in 2 weeks and was now squinting at the lamplight. Leah stood at the counter with a notebook. Barrow sat on a chair by the door and looked at everyone with equal attention. Daniel stood before them. He spoke simply, in short sentences. He said they all owed him. That was a fact. But a debt is not a chain. A debt is a bond. They are connected to one another through it. Torin bakes bread from the flour sold by So's shop. Hogan the innkeeper sells that bread. Maris does Hogan's laundry. They all buy from So. Money circulates. Every time it passes through someone's hands, it creates work, food, warmth. He said he wanted to set up a communal box. Each of them puts whatever they can into the box, once a week, even a penny. The box sits in So's shop. Leah keeps track. Every coin is recorded. If someone needs help, the stove broke, a child got sick, the roof started leaking, they take from the box, on record, on their word of honor, with a neighbor's guarantee. No interest. Silence. Torin asked first. He asked how this was different from a loan shark. Daniel replied that a loan shark takes. The box gives. A loan shark works for himself. The box works for everyone. A loan shark takes interest. The box takes trust. And if someone doesn't pay it back, they'll be ashamed. Not in front of Daniel, but in front of Torrent, in front of Maris, in front of the whole street. Olden asked, "What if someone doesn't pay it back after all?" Daniel replied that then he wouldn't pay it back, and everyone would know. And the next time he needed help, he'd remember. Ham sat quietly, twisting a button on his shirt. Then he suddenly said he'd put in 2 pennies. Everyone looked at him. Ham blushed, but he didn't back down. Maris said she put in 1. Torrin sighed and said he'd put in 5. Olden said he wouldn't put in anything, but if anyone needed blacksmithing work, he'd do it at cost. Daniel nodded. That was even better than money. It was a service. You can't steal a service. You can't devalue it. You can't confiscate it. Leah turned to a new page in her notebook. She wrote at the top, Small Harbor Community Fund, and she began writing down names. Barrow sat by the door and said nothing, but Daniel noticed that he had leaned forward slightly. When everyone had left, Leah bolted the door and turned to Daniel. She said he had done the impossible. 5 people who 2 weeks ago were afraid of one another had just sat down at the same table and reached an agreement. Daniel replied that it wasn't impossible. It was economics. Leah shook her head. She said no, it wasn't economics. It was something else. She didn't know the word, but she could feel it. Daniel could too. He had felt it for 7 years behind the monitors, between the lines of the quotes, behind the numbers that stood for oil, grain, copper, silver. Behind every price stood a person, their fear, their greed, their hope. Daniel had always seen it. On Wall Street, that made him a good analyst. At Malaya Preston, it made him something else. He didn't know what yet, but the communal box sat on the counter. Inside were 8 copper coins. And that was the beginning. On the 14th day, Una returned. Daniel was standing behind the counter counting the bags when the bell jingled. Una walked in and silently placed a bundle on the table. She unwrapped it. 3 dresses. Daniel looked and forgot what he was counting. The first was made of dark blue fabric, a simple cut, but the seams were so even they looked as if they had been drawn. The collar stood on its own. The hem fell in a smooth wave. On the bottom edge, a small embroidered letter, Y, in silver thread. The second dress was light-colored, almost white, with a delicate pattern on the sleeves. The pattern repeated something resembling leaves, but not leaves. Something unique, something Daniel had never seen in any catalog, in any store, in any lifetime. The third was red, bright, bold, with a high waist and a flared hem. You wear a dress like that when you want everyone to turn around. Una stood nearby and stared at the floor. Her fingers fiddled with the edge of her apron. Daniel picked up the blue dress. He held it up. He looked at the light. He put it back. He said they weren't dresses. Una looked up. Fear flashed in her eyes. Daniel finished his sentence. He said they were works of art and that he knew how to sell them. Una exhaled. The color returned to her face. Daniel sat down at the table and began to explain. In Orelon, clothes were sold like sacks of grain, by the weight of the fabric. Silk was expensive. Linen was cheap. Lace was somewhere in the middle. The seamstress's skill wasn't factored in. The customer paid for the material and considered the labor a bonus, as if the hours spent on every stitch were worth nothing. Daniel was going to turn that logic on its head. He took a piece of paper and drew a simple table. On the left was the cost of materials. On the right, the cost of labor. At the bottom, the total. The cost of labor was 3 times the cost of materials. Una looked at the numbers and said that no one would pay that much for a dress from a seamstress in Little Harbor. Daniel replied that she was right. No one would pay for a dress from a seamstress in Little Harbor, but they would pay for a dress with the Y label. Because the label isn't just a letter. The label is a promise that every seam will be even, that the fabric will be the best, that the cut will be one of a kind, No one else wears anything like it. It's not just clothing, it's a name. Yuna was silent. Leah stood nearby, listening with her mouth agape. Barrow, standing in the doorway of the back room, was listening too, though he pretended to be sorting through a box of grains. Daniel continued. He said they wouldn't be selling at Little Wharf. There's no money there. He'll take one dress to the fabric shop at the Central Market. The shop owner is a woman named Mrs. Talon. She dresses the wives of middle-class merchants. Not the rich ones, but those who want to look rich. These women will pay triple the price for a dress that no one else wears. Yuna asked how he knew about Mrs. Talon. Daniel replied that he goes to the market every morning, and he has a habit of looking not only at the merchandise, but also at the customers. Who buys what? Who looks at what? Who touches the fabric but leaves without buying? He had seen at least 4 women who felt the silk at Ms. Talon's and left because all the dresses were the same. Standard cut, standard color, boring. Yuna listened, holding her breath. Daniel said that next week he would take a blue dress to Mrs. Talon. Not for sale, just to show. Let it hang in the shop for 2 days. If no one asked for it, he'd take it back. Yuna nodded. Her hands were no longer fidgeting with her apron. They lay quietly on the table, for the first time during the entire conversation. She left, taking 2 dresses with her. The blue one remained. Leah carefully hung it on a hook by the wall. She looked at it. She smoothed out a fold. She looked again. Then she said quietly that she wanted one like that. Daniel said she would have it. Leah smiled. For the first time in 2 weeks. The next morning, Daniel took the blue dress to the Central Market. Mrs. Talon was a woman in her 50s, with a sharp nose and an even sharper gaze. She had been selling fabrics and ready-made dresses for 25 years. Her reputation rested on 2 pillars, quality and predictability. Her customers knew exactly what they were getting. That was both her advantage and her trap. Daniel walked into the shop and asked for a moment of her time. Talon looked him up and down. A boy from Little Harbor, a patched shirt, skinny arms. She wanted to turn him down. But Daniel unfolded the dress. Talon fell silent. She took the dress in her hands, ran her finger along the seam, along the collar, along the hem, found the Y label, raised an eyebrow. She asked who had sewn it. Daniel replied that it was a master tailor from Little Harbor. Talina snorted. She said there were no master tailors from Little Harbor. Daniel replied that until today, that had been true. Talina looked at him for a long time. Then she said she would hang the dress. For 2 days. No promises. Daniel nodded and left. The next day, a young messenger boy from Talene came to his shop. He said the lady was asking for 2 more dresses. The blue one was sold 3 hours later. The customer, the grain merchant's wife, paid without haggling. Leah wrote the amount in her notebook and counted it twice. Then she looked at Daniel. He nodded. It was more than So's shop earned in a week. Daniel sent the messenger to Yuna. She came that evening. Daniel laid the money out in front of her, the entire amount, minus the cost of the fabric he had provided her. Yuna counted the coins. She counted them again. Her lips trembled. She asked if it was all for her. Daniel replied that it was. It was her work. Her hands. Her mark. He was only a middleman. Yuna sat and stared at the coins. Then she stood up, said thank you, and left. Leah said she'd been crying on the stairs. Daniel knew. He'd heard. But he didn't go out. Some things a person needs to experience alone. By the end of the 3rd week, the dresses with the U label were the talk of the shop at Talon's. 4 sold. 5 were on order. Yuna sewed 2 a week and refused to rush. Daniel didn't interfere. Quality matters more than speed. He'd learned that rule not on Wall Street, but at Little Harbor. watching Yuna run the needle through the fabric as if she were talking to it. The communal box was growing. 23 pennies, then 31. Ham brought 5. Maris, 2. Torin put in his 5 every week like clockwork. Olden was the first to use the box. His hammer had cracked. A new one cost more than he earned in a month. He came to Daniel that evening. Without looking up, he said what he needed. Daniel handed over the amount. Leah wrote it down. Alden left. 3 days later, he returned and put the first payment back into the box, silently. Daniel didn't say a word. Leah wrote it down. It worked. Slowly, quietly, without fanfare, but it worked. People paid not because they were afraid, but because they knew their names were recorded, that Torin was watching, that Maris was watching, that Leah was recording every penny. Shame turned out to be more powerful than interest rates. Daniel knew this from game theory. Repeated interactions in small groups with transparent information foster cooperation. On Wall Street, it was called a behavioral model. At Little Pier, it was called a neighborhood. On the 21st day, what Daniel had both hoped for and feared at the same time happened. A stranger walked into the shop. Short, neat, a dark raincoat, slender fingers, a medallion shaped like a set of scales around his neck. He didn't introduce himself. He simply walked along the shelves. He looked at the price tags. He picked up a bag of lentils. He weighed it in his hand. He put it back. Then he turned to Daniel and asked how long he had been in business. Daniel replied that he had been since birth. It was both true and a lie. The man smiled, subtly, politely, like a cat smiles at a mouse that doesn't yet know it's a mouse. He said he'd stop by again and left. Leah asked who that was. Barrow answered from behind the counter. He said that the medallion shaped like scales was worn by the appraisers of the Guild of Haldors. Daniel nodded. He already knew, from Dane's memory. The appraisers are the eyes and ears of the guild. They walk through the markets. They inspect the goods. They inspect the merchants. They check where the money is coming from. Someone in the guild noticed that something strange was happening at Little Wharf. A small shop that had been bankrupt 3 weeks ago suddenly came back to life. Debts have been paid off. The goods are fresh. Cash flows have changed. Someone asked a question and sent a man with scales around his neck. Daniel looked at the door through which the appraiser had left, then at Leah, then at Barrow. He said they needed to be more careful. Barrow looked at him for a long time. Then, for the first time in 3 weeks, he spoke plainly. He said that the young owner runs the business as if he weren't 18 but twice that age. That he uses words Dane had never known. That he looks at the scales as if he sees in them no one else can see. And that old Barrow isn't going to ask why. Because he doesn't care who's in that body, as long as that someone saves the shop and looks after Leah. But, and here Barrow lowered his voice, if that someone hurts the girl, then old Barrow would find a way. Daniel looked at him, an old man, stooped, gray sideburns, hands stained from work, eyes absolutely clear, absolutely serious. Daniel said he understood. Barrow nodded and went to sort through the bags, as if nothing had happened. Leah didn't hear. She was upstairs. Daniel stood in the silence of the empty shop and felt the stone of guilt in his chest grow even heavier. Barrow knew. Not everything, but enough. And he chose not to ask, because he loved this family more than he feared the truth. That night, Daniel lay on his mattress and stared at the ceiling. The Haldor appraiser. That was the first call. There would be more to come. He couldn't grow too fast. Every extra bar was a risk. Every successful deal drew attention. And attention from the Haldors meant a visit with scales, and then a visit with a club, and then a visit with a torch. He closed his eyes. He saw his mother in the kitchen in Queens. This time, she was looking at him. She said he had finally stopped rushing. Daniel opened his eyes. A ceiling with water stains, the smell of mold, a dog barking in the distance. He hadn't stopped rushing. He had only just begun. The appraiser returned 3 days later. This time, he wasn't alone. A second man walked beside him, larger, broader in the shoulders, without a medallion, but with that particular expression Daniel had learned to recognize back in New York. Security who pretends not to be security. The appraiser entered the shop and this time introduced himself. His name was Renard. He said he served the southern branch of the Guild of Halldors and that he had been tasked with auditing the business operations of So's shop. Standard procedure, nothing personal. Daniel nodded and offered tea. Renard declined. He asked for the ledgers. Daniel looked at Leah. She was standing by the counter, clutching the notebook with both hands. He nodded at her. She slowly placed the notebook on the table. Renard opened it. He read for a minute. 2, 5. His eyebrows rose higher and higher. He flipped through page after page. Every entry, every number, every name. Income, expenses, date, total. Everything added up. Renard closed the notebook and looked at Daniel. He said it was the best accounting he'd seen at Little Harbor. Daniel replied that it was all thanks to Leah. Renard turned to her. She didn't look away. He asked who had taught her. She replied that no one had. Renard was silent for a moment. Then he said that the books were good, but the issue wasn't the books. The issue was the source of the capital. 3 weeks ago, So's shop was bankrupt. Today, the shelves were full. The neighbor's debts had been paid off. Where did the money come from? Daniel was ready. He pulled a stack of documents from under the counter. A contract with wholesaler Graham for flour supplies. A receipt from Toran for bread products. An agreement with Mrs. Talon for the sale of sewn goods. Receipts for fabric purchases. Every penny had a paper trail. Every ingot that had passed through Graham's hands bore a mark and a story. Daniel had built this chain of evidence specifically for this moment. Renard was leafing through the papers. His companion stood by the door, staring at the shelves with an expression of complete indifference. Renard asked where the initial capital had come from, the very same ingot with which Daniel had paid off his debts. Daniel replied that it was an inheritance from his father, hidden before his death. He had found it by chance while clearing out the basement. Renard asked why the ingot had no hallmark. Daniel replied that his father had bought it long ago, from a prospector in the northern foothills. Back then, not everyone put hallmarks on them. Renard looked at him. Daniel looked at Renard. The silence lasted 4 seconds. Then, Renard stacked the papers on the table and said he had no further questions for now. He would take copies for the report. Daniel replied that the copies were ready. He handed over the second stack, identical to the first. Renard took it and, for the first time during the entire visit, tilted his head slightly. It was a gesture not of disrespect, but of surprise. An 18-year-old boy from Little Harbor had prepared copies for a guild appraiser to review. Renard had never seen anything like it. They left. Leah exhaled so loudly that Barrow turned around from the back room. She said her hands were shaking. Daniel replied that his were too. It was true. Not because he was afraid of Renard, but because Renard was smart. Smart enemies are more dangerous than strong ones. Renard saw that the numbers added up, but he sensed there was something else behind the numbers, and he would be back. Daniel knew this, as surely as he knew the dollar to yen exchange rate on any given Thursday. That evening, he went out onto the street. Little Pier went about its business. The smell of boiled cabbage wafted from Hogan's Tavern. A hammer clanged at Olden's smithy. A new hammer, bought with money from the community fund. Children were running along the pavement. Somewhere, a woman was singing. Out of tune, but with gusto. Daniel stood on the shop's porch and thought. The communal fund was working. Yuna's dresses were selling. The shop was bringing in income. But it was all fragile. He had fooled one appraiser. He might not fool the second. He needed something more than a shop, something that would carry legal weight, a seal, a charter, status. He needed a chamber of accounts. He went back inside and sat down at the table. He took a sheet of paper. He began to write. He was drafting the charter, in the language of Orelon, but with the logic of the 21st century. The Small Harbor Clearinghouse. Purpose: accepting deposits from local residents, issuing loans secured by guarantees, recording and storing warehouse receipts, cargo insurance, management, a board of 5 depositors, chief accountant, director, guarantees. Every deposit is recorded. Every loan is justified. Every receipt has a number and a date. Quarterly audit. Open book. Any depositor can look at it at any time. He wrote for 3 hours. Leah had fallen asleep upstairs. Barrow had long since gone to his room. The candle burned steadily. The pen scratched. When Daniel finished, 12 pages lay before him. He reread them, corrected 2 words, reread them again. In New York, a team of lawyers would have taken 3 months to draft such a document. Here, one man did it in a single night. But the essence was the same: rules, trust, transparency. He folded the pages and put them in a desk drawer. Tomorrow he would show them to Ari. He didn't yet know who Ari was, but she was already on her way to him, with a knife. She entered after closing time. Daniel was sitting at his desk, rewriting the charter when the bell rang. He looked up. A young woman in a men's suit stood in the doorway. Her dark hair was cut short. Her eyes were gray and cold. Her right hand was in her pocket. Daniel immediately realized there was a knife in that pocket. From the way she held her shoulder, from the way she turned her body, from the way she stood half a step from the door, ready to leave at any moment. She asked if he was Daniel So. He replied that he was. She said her name was Ariel Venz. Daniel recognized the surname from Dane's memory, the Venz Trading House, once the 3rd largest in southern Viencourt. 3 years ago, the Haldors destroyed them, bought up their debts, crushed prices on the routes. They blocked access to the caravan routes. Ariel's father knelt before a guild representative and begged for a reprieve. He was refused. A month later, he died, officially of illness. At the small harbor, they said it was from shame. Ariel said she'd heard about him, that some kid named So was buying up debts in her old neighborhood, playing the benefactor, handing out other people's money. Daniel replied that the money was his own. Ariel smirked. She said she didn't care whose it was. She was interested in something else. She wanted to know who he was working for, because the boys from Little Wharf don't buy up debts with gold bars. There's always someone behind them, the Haldors, or someone from the minor guilds, or someone new she doesn't know yet. Daniel replied that no one was behind him. Ariel took her hand out of her pocket. In her hand was a knife, short, narrow, with a bone handle. She placed it on the table between them, blade toward Daniel. She said it was her knife, the only thing she had left, and that if Daniel was working for the Haldors, she would use it. Daniel looked at the knife, then at Ariel. She wasn't bluffing. You could tell by her hands. They weren't shaking. He said he understood, and that if he were working for the Haldors, he'd deserve it. Then he said he wanted to show her something. He took the charter out of the drawer, 12 pages. He placed it next to the knife. Ariel looked at the papers, then at Daniel. She picked up the first page. She began to read. A minute later, she sat down, without asking permission. Her legs just buckled on their own. She read in silence, page after page. Her face changed, first disbelief, then interest, then something like hunger. She finished the last page and put it on the table. She was silent for 30 seconds. Daniel was counting. Then she said it was impossible. The chamber of accounts, joint deposits, guaranteed loans, warehouse receipts. This isn't a shop, it's a bank, a real bank on Small Pier. She said the guilds would crush it in a week. Daniel replied that they wouldn't if the chamber were registered as a craft guild. There's a loophole in Viencore's laws. Craft guilds have the right to internal settlements among members. It's an old law, from before the guilds. No one repealed it because no one thought anyone would use it. Ariel stared at him. She asked how he knew about this law. Daniel replied that he reads a lot. That was half true. Dane's memory held fragments. Daniel pieced them together with the instinct of a lawyer who had spent 7 years in an environment where regulatory loopholes were a daily necessity. Ariel picked up a knife from the table. Daniel didn't move. She put the knife in her pocket. Then she said he had no people, no experience, no connections, no name. He had a fancy piece of paper and a shop that smelled of lentils. Daniel agreed. He said it was all true. That was exactly why he needed someone with experience, connections, a name. Someone whose surname still meant something in Viencore's business circles. Someone like Ven's. Ariel narrowed her eyes. She said he was a smart aleck. Daniel replied that he was. She asked what he was offering her. Daniel replied that he was offering the position of Chief Operating Officer of the Small Harbor Clearinghouse. Full access to the books, a vote on the board, and a chance to do what her father hadn't had time to do. To build something the Haldors couldn't take away, because you can't take away what belongs to everyone. Ariel was silent. For a minute. Daniel waited. He knew how to wait. 7 years behind computer screens had taught him that the best deals are closed in silence. Ariel stood up. She said she'd think about it, and left, without saying goodbye. She took the knife with her. Leah came downstairs 5 minutes later. She'd heard everything. The walls in the house are thin. She asked if she could trust this woman. Daniel replied that she couldn't be trusted, but he could work with her. Because Ariel Vance has something Daniel doesn't. Anger. The right kind of anger. Focused anger. The anger of a person who knows exactly who their enemy is. Leah frowned. She said that anger is a poor foundation. Daniel looked at her. She's 16. She'd been doing the books for a bankrupt shop all by herself for 2 years. She knows more about foundations than any Wall Street analyst. He said that Leah was right. Anger is a poor foundation, but it's good fuel. Ariel returned 2 days later, without a doc. In her hands, she held her own notebook, a thick one, covered in small, neat handwriting. She placed the notebook on the table and said it was a list. All the trading houses in southern Viencore that the Haldors had ruined over the past 3 years. 47 names, addresses, amounts owed, connections, who owed whom, who traded with whom, who hates whom. A map of the destroyed economy of an entire region. Daniel opened the notebook and began to read. 5 minutes later, he looked up. He said it was priceless. Ariel replied that she knew. Then she sat down across from him and said she accepted the offer. But she had 2 conditions. First, she wouldn't take orders. She works alongside him as an equal. Second, when the time comes for the Haldors, she wants to be in the front row. Daniel held out his hand. Ariel shook it, firmly, dryly, businesslike. Leah wrote it down in the notebook. New employee, Ariel Vance. Position, Chief Operating Officer. Barrow snorted from the back room. But when Ariel walked past him, he stepped aside slightly, like a man who recognizes a breed. Ariel started work the next day, and within the first week, Daniel realized 2 things. First, she was better than him at negotiations. Not in strategy, In tactics, Daniel saw the system. Ariel saw the people. She knew which of the merchants in southern Vi drank in the evenings, who beat his wife, who hid money from the guild in the wall behind the stove, who hated the Haldors quietly, and who did so loudly. This knowledge was worth more than any ingot. The second thing he realized, Ariel didn't trust him. She worked, honestly, rigorously, effectively, but every evening she took her notebook home. Every morning, she double-checked Leah's entries. She was looking for a catch, because in her world, there was always a catch. Daniel wasn't offended. He understood. On the first Monday of the second month, they registered the accounting chamber. Daniel and Ariel arrived at the Viencourt City Council office early in the morning. The building was gray, stone. It smelled of ink and old paper. The clerk behind the counter looked down at them. A boy in a patched shirt and a girl in a men's suit. He asked what they wanted. Daniel placed the charter on the counter, 12 pages, stapled, with the signatures of 5 contributors: Toran, Maris, Olden, Ham, and Una. Una signed it yesterday. Her hand was shaking, but her signature was clear. The clerk took the charter and began to read. After 3 pages, he called for his supervisor. The senior official came over. He read it. He called his boss. The boss read it and asked one question. He asked on what grounds they were registering. Daniel replied that it was based on the Trade Guilds Act, paragraph 42, the right to internal settlements among guild members. The boss looked at him for a long time. Then he opened a thick volume of laws. He found the section. He read it. He read it again. He closed the volume. He said that formally everything was correct, but this law hadn't been used in 200 years. Daniel replied that the law has no statute of limitations. If it hasn't been repealed, then it's in effect. The chief looked at Ariel. She stood straight and looked at him the way people look at him who know the laws better than those who enforce them. The chief affixed the seal. Small Harbor Accounting Chamber, registered, legal, valid. When they stepped outside, Ariel smiled for the first time, briefly, with one corner of her mouth. She said she hadn't believed it would work. Daniel replied that he hadn't either. Ariel looked at him. Then she said he was a bad liar. He knew for sure it would work. Daniel didn't argue. A week later, the chamber was up and running. Physically, it was located in the back room of So's shop. Barrow hauled out the old boxes. Olden made a new table and 2 chairs. Una sewed a curtain for the doorway. Leah placed her notebook on the table. The official ledger of the Small Harbor Accounting Office. Her handwriting, her signature. On the cover, she wrote her name and title, Chief Accountant. Daniel watched her do it and felt something he hadn't felt in 7 years in New York. Pride. Not for himself, for her. The chamber's first client was someone Daniel hadn't expected, a pharmacist, a woman of about 27, short, wearing glasses, with dark circles under her eyes. She walked into the shop and asked if it was true that they gave interest-free loans here. Leah replied that it was true, with a guarantor. The woman asked what kind of guarantor. Leah explained, you need one neighbor who will confirm that the borrower is trustworthy. The guarantor doesn't pay for the borrower. They stand by their word, by their name. The woman was silent. Then she said that her neighbors knew her, that she gave small loans to widows and students, on her word of honor. No paperwork. She loses money on it, but she can't stop, because she fell silent. Daniel came out of the back room. He had heard the whole conversation. He said it was because of her brother. The woman flinched. She looked up at him. Behind her glasses, her eyes were red. She asked how he knew. Daniel replied that everyone at Little Pier knew. Her name was Mei Lin Cho. Her older brother had killed himself 2 years ago, a debt to the Haldo. He couldn't pay it, couldn't ask, couldn't bear it. Ever since then, Mei Lin had been giving money to anyone who came. Widows, students, the elderly. She couldn't say no because every time she saw her brother's face. Daniel said she didn't need a loan. She needed a system. She gives out money without keeping track. No repayment, no structure. It's burning. In a year, she'll have nothing left. Mei Ling took off her glasses and wiped them with the sleeve of her shirt. She said she knew. Daniel offered her a chair. She sat down. He poured tea. She took the mug with both hands. He said he had an idea. Microloans, small amounts, guaranteed by neighbors. Not just one person, but three. 3 neighbors vouch for the borrower. If the borrower doesn't pay back, it's not just the lender who's embarrassed. It's a shame in front of the 3 people who vouched for him. Her pharmacy becomes the first branch. She isn't the only one handing out the loans. The system hands them out. The system collects them back. Mei Lin listened. She drank her tea. Then she set down the mug and said that this was what she'd been waiting for 2 years. She didn't know exactly what, but she'd been waiting. Daniel nodded. He understood. Sometimes a person needs not a solution, but permission. Permission to stop carrying everything alone. Mei Lin left. She returned in the evening with a box. Inside the box were receipts, dozens of them, crumpled, some on napkins, some on scraps of wrapping paper. All her debtors. Amounts, names. Not a single date, not a single guarantor, just names and numbers. Daniel and Leah sat until midnight, transferring everything into a notebook. They sorted them, numbered them, dated them. When they were done, Leah put down her pen and said her hands hurt. Daniel said she could go to sleep. Leah replied that she couldn't. She wanted to finish. She finished. By 3 in the morning, Mei Lin had a complete ledger, 28 debtors. The total amount was small, but for one woman, it was insurmountable. Ridiculous for the system. In the morning, Daniel showed the ledger to Ariel. She looked at the numbers and said that half could be recovered in 2 months if the payment schedules were set up correctly. The other half would have to be written off. Daniel agreed. They drew up a plan. Each debtor was given a deadline, small amounts, once a week. 3 guarantors from among the neighbors were assigned to each debtor. Mei Lin delivered the new receipts in 2 days. A week later, the first 4 had paid back. Not because they were afraid of Mei Lin, because their guarantor, Uncle One from the 3rd floor, met them on the stairs every morning and asked how the repayments were going. Not threatening, not shouting, just asking. It was scarier than any debt collector. Mei Lin came to the shop 10 days later. She brought tea, 8 varieties, in little paper bags. Each bag had a name on it. She said she brews different tea depending on the mood of the person she's talking to. For Daniel, she chose a bitter green tea. He asked why it was bitter. She replied that it was because he was tired but wouldn't admit it. Daniel took the tea, took a sip, and for the first time in a month in this world, he allowed himself to close his eyes. Not to count, but simply to rest, for 3 seconds. Then he opened them. There was too much work. The caravan season began in the middle of the 3rd month. From the south came caravans carrying salt and spices. From the east came silk and dyes. From the north came iron and lumber. Roads stretched between the cities, which in Orlan were called arteries because the lifeblood of the economy flowed through them. And like any arteries, they were vulnerable. Bandits, gangs of former soldiers and impoverished peasants. They robbed caravans on the stretches between cities. Losses ranged from 20 to 40%, depending on the route. Every caravan operator factored these losses into the price. That's why salt that cost 2 copper coins in Yashan cost 80 in Viancourt, 40 times. Daniel looked at that figure and saw not a problem, but an opportunity. Arbitrage. The price difference between 2 points. On Wall Street, he had built models that spotted arbitrage in milliseconds. Here, the arbitrage lay on the surface, as vast as a continent. All he had to do was reduce losses on the roads. And for that, He needed security. He asked Ariel if she knew any mercenaries he could trust. Ariel looked at him as if he'd asked if she knew what rain was. She said you couldn't trust mercenaries. But there is one person, or rather one woman, a former street fighter. She left the gang a year ago. She lives in a flop house by the South Gate. She takes small jobs, guarding warehouses, escorting merchants to the market. Nothing serious, but among mercenaries, she's known. They're afraid of her, because she's the kind who strikes first and strikes only once. Her name was Savan Pak. Daniel found her the next day. The flop house by the South Gate smelled of sweat and sour beer. A long room with 2 rows of bunks, half of them empty. Savan sat against the wall, sharpening her sword. 2 short blades lay nearby. She was tall, taller than Daniel. Dark hair pulled back into a knot, a scar on her left cheekbone. Her eyes were calm and empty, like someone who had seen enough to stop being surprised. A bowl stood on a stool nearby, empty. She looked up when Daniel approached. She looked at him. She sized him up. She went back to the sword. He said he was looking for guards for a caravan. Savan replied without looking up. She asked where. Daniel that it was to Yeshin, the southern route, 12 days one way. Savan stopped sharpening. She said the southern route was death. 3 gangs at the pass, 2 on the plain. Dusty fields with magical anomalies between them. She asked how many wagons. Daniel replied that there was 1. Savan looked at him for the first time, really seeing him. 1 wagon on the southern route. That's not trade. That's suicide. Daniel said the wagon would go empty one way. It would be loaded with salt on the way back. The margin on the salt would cover all expenses and yield a profit for the chamber. Savan asked how much he was paying. Daniel named the amount. She raised an eyebrow. It was twice the market rate. She asked what the catch was. Daniel said the catch was that he was paying up front, half as an advance, half upon return, and that this wasn't a one-time contract. If the route worked out, there would be more, every month, with a fixed salary, with compensation in case of injury, with a payment to the family in case of death. Savan froze. She held her sword and looked at Daniel as if he had said something in a foreign language. She asked what the payment to the family meant. Daniel explained, if something happens to a guard on the route, the accounting chamber will pay his closest relative a certain amount, every month, for a year, so the family isn't left without means. Savan put down her sword. She asked why he was doing this. Mercenaries are hired and forgotten. If one dies, they hire another. That's how it's always been. Daniel replied that it was like that because mercenaries were considered expendable, but he considers them people who need a reason to come back alive. Fear of death is poor motivation. Knowing that your sister won't be thrown out onto the street is good motivation. Savan was silent. Daniel saw something flicker across her face. For a second, no more. Then she turned to stone again. She said she had a sister, a younger one. She lives in a village on the northern border. Savan sends her money when she can. She agrees, but she wants to see the contract in writing. Daniel nodded. He went back into the shop and sat down to write. It was the first employment contract in Orelon to include a clause on compensation and a pension. Daniel wrote it by hand. Name, Savan Pak. Position, caravan guard of the accounting chamber. Pay, fixed, monthly. Compensation in case of injury. Full payment for medical treatment plus living expenses during recovery. Payment in case of death. 12 months of full support to the next of kin. Pension. After 5 years of service, a monthly payment for life. He signed. Leah affixed the chamber's seal. Ariel certified it as a witness. Daniel took the contract to Savan personally, She was sitting in the same flophouse, the same wall, the same stool, the same swords. He placed the paper in front of her. Savan took it. She read slowly. She ran her finger along the lines. Her lips moved. Daniel realized she was reading with difficulty. Not illiterate, but close to it. She finished reading. She reread it. She looked up. Her eyes were dry, but something in them had changed, as if someone had cracked open the door to a room she had long locked away. She signed her name. It was clumsy, almost childish. Then she said she was leaving in 3 days. She needed time to plan the route and find a driver. Daniel nodded and left. That night, Savan didn't sleep. She sat on her cot and reread the contract by the light of a candle stub, over and over, until dawn. 3 days later, the caravan left through the southern gates of Viencourt. 1 wagon, 1 driver. An old man named Felt, who had driven caravans for 40 years and knew every pothole on the southern road. Savan walked alongside the wagon, 2 swords at her belt, eyes on the road. Daniel stood at the gate and watched them leave. Leah stood beside him. She said she was afraid for them. Daniel replied that he was too, but fear was the price of change. Leah asked what if they didn't come back. Daniel replied that then he would pay Savan's family everything he had promised, every penny, and send the next caravan. Leah looked at him. Then she said quietly that a real Dane wouldn't have said that. Daniel didn't answer. The stone in his chest grew heavier. They stood at the gate and watched the road until the wagon became a dot. The caravan returned 26 days later. Daniel was standing at the south gate when he saw the wagon on the road. It was moving slowly, heavily, laden. Savan walked beside it, alive. Daniel exhaled and only then realized he'd been holding his breath. The wagon drew closer. The driver, Felt, sat on the box and smiled with his toothless mouth. Savan had a fresh cut on her left forearm. It was neatly bandaged. She walked steadily. She wasn't limping. Under the wagon's canopy lay sacks of salt. Daniel counted 20. 20 sacks of salt from Yeshon. Purchase price, 2 copper coins per sack. Selling price in Viencourt, 60. A 30-fold markup. Minus travel expenses, minus Savan's pay, minus Felt's pay, minus the cost of the wagon. Net profit. Daniel calculated it in his head in 4 seconds. The profit covered all the chamber's expenses for the next 2 months, from a single caravan. Savan stopped in front of him. She said there had been a skirmish at the pass, 3 bandits. She took out 2. The third one got away. The driver wasn't hurt. The salt is safe. She said it in an even voice, like a report. Daniel asked about the cut. She looked at her hand as if she'd forgotten about it, said it was just a scratch. Daniel replied that, scratch or not, she was going to see Mei Lin. The apothecary would treat the wound, at the chamber's expense. Clause 4 of the contract, medical compensation. Savan looked at him. Then she nodded, silently. They unloaded the cart into the warehouse that Ariel had rented a week ago, a small room by the pier, dry, locked. Ariel stood at the entrance and counted the sacks. Her face was inscrutable, but Daniel saw the corners of her lips lift slightly. 20 sacks. This was proof. Not words, not plans, not a charter. Goods, profit, results. Ariel said she knew 4 buyers who would take it all in 2 days. Daniel replied that they shouldn't sell it all at once, 5 sacks a week, so as not to crash the price. Ariel looked at him, then she nodded. She said he was thinking like a merchant. Daniel replied that he was a merchant. Ariel shaking her head. She said no. Traders don't think that way. Traders take profits now. He thinks 3 steps ahead. She didn't know what it was called. Daniel knew. It was called position trading, but he didn't explain it. Some words from his past life were useless here. That evening, Daniel gathered everyone in the back room. Leah, Ariel, Maylin, Savannah, who sat in the corner eating a bowl of porridge so intently as if it were the only thing that mattered. Barrow stood by the door. Daniel laid out papers on the table. He said the first caravan had proven the model. The route works. The margin is sufficient. Now we need to scale up. Ariel asked what scaling up meant. Daniel said it meant doing more. 2 caravans a month, then 4. Other routes. The east, silk, dyes. The north, iron. But for that, we need money for wagons, for security, for goods. The chamber is still too small. He looked at Ariel. He said it was time to use her list. 47 trading houses, ruined but not dead. Each one still has something left. A warehouse, a contact, a skill, knowledge of the route. If we bring them together, we can create a network. Each house contributes what it has. The chamber coordinates. Profits are distributed according to contribution. Ariel listened. Her eyes were shining. Not from tears, from something else. She said it was a cooperative. Daniel replied that it was. She said that cooperatives in Orlon were banned by the guilds. Daniel replied that cooperatives were banned, but craft guilds were not. Paragraph 42. Ariel smiled. For the first, truly. Not just the corner of her mouth, but her whole face. She said he was using the law as a weapon. Daniel replied that the law was the only weapon that worked against the guilds. You can't defeat them with a sword, but you can with paper. Maylin said quietly that she liked the idea, that her pharmacy could serve as a distribution point at the eastern end of Little Harbor, that she knew 3 families who dried herbs and could supply goods for the caravans. Savannah finished her porridge and said she knew 2 mercenaries who could be trusted. Former soldiers, not thugs, normal people who just couldn't find work after the war. Leah was silent. She was taking notes, every word, every name, every number. Daniel watched them. 5 women in a small room behind the lentil shop. A seamstress, an aristocrat, an apothecary, a mercenary, and a 16-year-old girl with a notebook. His team, his network, his beginning. 3 days later, Ariel began her rounds. She went to the addresses on her list. She knocked on doors. Many didn't open. Some opened and immediately closed them upon seeing who was standing there. The surname Venz evoked one of 2 reactions: sympathy or fear. Sympathy because everyone knew what had happened to her father. Fear because getting involved with someone who had already fallen under the Haldor's iron fist was dangerous. Ariel didn't give up. She kept coming back. She knocked again. She spoke. She explained. She showed them the chamber's charter. She showed them the figures for the first caravan. A week later, 4 agreed. An old spice merchant named Ridden. He still had a warehouse with contacts in eastern Sevhor. The widow of the shipbuilder Carr. She had connections with river transporters. The former money changer Tosh. He knew the exchange rates in every city on the mainland by heart and could convert any currency into any other in a second. And the herbalist Ilmer, an 80-year-old woman who remembered the days when the guilds didn't exist at all and who said she'd been waiting a long time for someone to finally get the idea. 4 out of 47. Not many, but more than yesterday. Daniel knew the rest were watching, waiting, seeing what would happen to the first ones. If the first 4 survived, more would come. If not, no one would come. The stakes were rising every day. On the 4th day after the caravan's return, a man whom Daniel had never seen before entered the shop. Tall, thin, grain temples, an expensive cloak. On his finger, a ring bearing a coat of arms that Daniel recognized from Dane's memory. A golden mountain on a black field. The Haldor coat of arms. Not an appraiser, not a collector. Someone of higher rank. He didn't introduce himself. He walked through the shop, looked at the price tags, looked at Leah behind the counter, at Barrow by the door, at the curtain behind which the chamber lay. Then he turned to Daniel. He said that Mr. Cassius Haldor had sent an invitation, dinner, in 3 days, at the Haldor estate on the Northern Hill, to Daniel So, personally. Daniel accepted the invitation. The man nodded and left. Leah approached Daniel. Her face was pale. She said that Cassius Haldor was neither an appraiser nor a collector. He was the head of the Southern Branch, the second most powerful person in the guild after the patriarch himself. If he invites someone to dinner, it means he considers Daniel worthy of attention. And the Haldor's attention is the last thing people receive before they disappear. Daniel replied that he knew, and that was exactly why he would go. Ariel, who had been standing behind the curtain and had heard everything, came out and said that he was an idiot. Daniel replied that perhaps he was, but turning down an invitation from the Haldors is an insult, and an insult is worse than dinner. At dinner, you can talk. After an insult, you can only remain silent. Ariel clenched her jaw. Then she said she was going with him. Daniel shook his head. He said the invitation was for one person. If he brought someone, it would look like fear. And the Haldors sense fear like sharks sense blood. Ariel wanted to object. She looked him in the eyes. She didn't object. Siobhan, who was cleaning her sword in the corner, looked up and said one word. She said she would wait at the estate gates. Daniel nodded. Mei Lin brought him tea, bitter green tea. He drank it. He looked out the window at Viencourt in the evening. Somewhere on the Northern Hill, in the estate with the golden mountain on the gate, a man was waiting for him who could crush everything Daniel had built in 3 months with a single stroke of his pen. Daniel finished his tea and went to pick out a shirt. He had only one. It was patched up. Una had brought a new one that morning. Without a word, she simply placed it on the counter and left. Dark blue, with even seams, with a small letter Y on the hem. The Haldor estate stood on the Northern Hill like a fortress. Stone walls, wrought iron gates with a golden mountain on a black field, torches along the driveway. Daniel walked along the paved path and counted the guards. 4 at the gate, 2 on the wall, 2 more at the entrance, 8 men. For a dinner with a boy from the lentil shop, that was a lot. So Cassius respected him, or feared him, or wanted Daniel to think he was respected. Any of those options would do. A servant in livery opened the door. He led him through a corridor lined with portraits. The guild's founders stared down from the walls with oily eyes. Stern, bearded men with their hands on sacks of gold. Daniel walked and thought that in New York, such portraits hung in the boardrooms of hedge funds. The same faces, the same idea. We were here before you and will be here after you. The dining room was enormous. A long table for 20 people, set for 2. Cassius Haldor sat at the head of the table, of medium height, thin, a neat graying beard, dark eyes, hands on the table, long fingers, a ring with a coat of arms on his little finger. He didn't stand up when Daniel entered. He just nodded toward the chair across from him. Daniel sat down. A servant poured wine. Daniel didn't touch it. Cassius noticed. He didn't comment. He said he was glad to finally meet him, that he'd heard interesting things about So's shop, about the price tags, about returns, about the communal box, about the caravan. His voice was even, pleasant, the voice of a man accustomed to being listened to. Daniel replied that he was glad the news had reached him. Cassius smiled. He said that news travels fast when someone does the impossible. And Daniel had done the impossible. He'd taken a dead district and brought it back to life in 3 months. That was impressive. Daniel was silent. He waited. Cassius continued. He said it was impressive, but also troubling, because Little Harbor's pulse wasn't beating in time with the guild's. Money isn't flowing where it's supposed to. Debts aren't being paid off through the guild, but through some chamber. The caravan isn't traveling under the Haldor flag, but under the flag of a craft guild. He uttered the last two words with a touch of irony, like a man who knows he's been shown a trick, but hasn't yet figured out how. Daniel replied that the chamber operates within the law. Paragraph 42. Cassius nodded. He said he knew about the paragraph, and that his lawyers were already working to have it repealed. But that would take time. In the meantime, he would like to offer Daniel another path, a partnership. The chamber would become part of the Halder Guild's structure as a subsidiary. Daniel remains in charge. He gets protection, access to trade routes, funding, in exchange for a share of the profits and accountability to the guild. Daniel listened. He knew this proposal before Cassius even voiced it. A takeover. That's how startups were bought on Wall Street. They'd find a small company with a good idea, offer money and protection, take control. The founder would remain with a title but no power. He replied that he was grateful for the offer, that he would think it over. Cassius tilted his head. He said there was nothing to think about. Either Daniel was with the guild or against it. There was no third option. Daniel looked him in the eye. He said there was. There was another option nearby. Not with, not against it. Right there. Cassius was silent. Then he laughed, briefly, without joy. He said that youth is beautiful. It believes you can stand by the river and not get wet. Then he stood up. Dinner was over. The food had never been served. Daniel realized that the food had never been the point, only the conversation. He stood up. He thanked them. He headed for the exit. At the door, Cassius called out to him. He said quietly, almost softly, that he had a daughter, 4 years old. He wants her to grow up in a world that has order. Not kindness, order. Because kindness without order is chaos, and chaos kills little girls. Daniel turned around. He replied that order without kindness is a prison, and a prison cripples little girls just as badly as chaos. Cassius looked at him for a long time. Then he nodded, not in agreement, to show he'd heard. Daniel stepped out into the night. Savan was waiting at the gate, just as she'd promised, in silence. They walked back across the entire city. The streetlights burned dimly. The streets were empty. Savan asked how it went. Daniel replied that Cassius had offered a partnership. Savan asked what he had said. Daniel said he had said no. Savan nodded. Then she said that now the real thing would begin. Daniel knew she was right. Rejecting the Haldor's offer was a declaration of war. Not a loud one, not with fanfare, a quiet one, like a knife being pulled from a pocket. Cassius wouldn't have offered twice. Now the pressure would start. A week later, the pressure began. Small at first. Wholesaler Graham said he could no longer sell flour to So's shop. He'd been threatened. He didn't say who, but Daniel knew. Then innkeeper Hogan tore up his contract with Torin. He got scared. Then a city council inspector came to the chamber for an inspection. He found 3 violations, minor ones, technicalities, but each one carried a potential fine. Ariel turned pale with rage. She wanted to go to Cassius and throw all 3 penalty notices in his face. Daniel stopped her. He said that anger is fuel, not a steering wheel. They needed to maneuver, not fight. Graham couldn't sell, so they needed another wholesaler. Daniel found him in 2 days. Tosh, one of the new chamber members, knew a flour merchant in the Eastern District. The merchant feared the Haldors, but needed money. Daniel offered 3 months advance payment. The merchant agreed. Hogan terminated his contract with Torin. Daniel found Torin another buyer, A hotel by the port. The hotel owner was on Ariel's list, a former trading house ruined by the Haldors. She took Torrin's bread without haggling, out of solidarity, and for the profit. Daniel paid the fines, all three, on time, with a receipt, and he took copies to the city archives, so it would be documented. He countered every blow from the Haldors not with a direct counterattack, but with a flanking maneuver. They closed the door. He found a window. They blocked the stream. He dug a canal. By the end of the 4th month, the pressure had intensified, but the chamber not only held its ground, it grew. 17 members, 3 caravan routes, 2 warehouses, and a reputation that spread through Viencourt like heat from a stove. People talked about the chamber, in the markets, in the taverns, at the docks. They said there was a place where you could borrow without a noose, where a receipt meant exactly what was written on it, where a little girl with a notebook recorded every copper coin, and no one ever went missing. Winter came early. By the 6th month, the first snow had fallen on Little Wharf, and the temperature dropped so quickly that the pipes in the old houses burst overnight. Daniel stood by the shop window and looked out onto the street. A gray sky, a thin white layer on the pavement. Children were sculpting something out of the dirty snow. Old woman Ilmer was dragging a bundle of firewood. Smoke was coming from Baker Torrin's chimney. None was coming from Widow Maris's. Daniel threw on a jacket and went out. An hour later, he knew the extent of the problem. Torrin's oven had burned out. Not entirely. The damper that Olden had made 3 months ago had cracked from the temperature change. Without the damper, the oven was running at half strength. There wouldn't be enough bread for the neighborhood. Yuna's mother was sick, a fever, a cough. She needed medicine that cost more than Yuna earned in a week. Widow Maris had nothing to heat her home with. Her supply of firewood was gone. She had no money for more. Hogan, the innkeeper, was delaying payment again. This time it wasn't out of laziness, but because the Haldors had put pressure on him and his suppliers had doubled their prices. Daniel returned to the shop. He sat down at the table. He closed his eyes for 3 seconds. Then he opened them and began to work. He sent Leah to Olden with an order for a new damper. Urgent, payment from the Chamber's fund. Olden began forging it that very hour. He sent a note to Mei Lin asking her to prepare medicine for Yuna's mother. Mei Lin replied that she had the medicine. But she buys one ingredient from a merchant at the Eastern Market. The merchant raised the price. The Haldors. Daniel wrote this. Tosh found the same ingredient at the herbalist Ilmer's. Cheaper, fresher. Mei Lin had the medicine ready by evening. Firewood for Maris. Daniel contacted Kara, the shipbuilder's widow. She knew the river carriers. One of them transported lumber. Daniel negotiated a month's supply of firewood for 3 families at wholesale price. Payment from the profits of the 2nd caravan. Every problem, every solution, every connection went through the network he had been building for 6 months. Without the network, each of these problems would have been a disaster. With the network, each was a challenge. By evening, Daniel had gathered everyone in the chamber hall. The back room of the shop had long since become too cramped. Now, meetings were held in the shop itself. The counter had been pushed against the wall. The sacks were cleared away. A table stood in the middle. On the table was a single candle and the communal cash box. Everyone had come. Torrin, Maris with her daughter, Olden, Ham, Yuna, Mei Lin, Ridden, Kara, Tosh, Ilmer, 7 more people who had joined over the past 2 months. Savan stood by the door. Ariel sat to Daniel's right, Leah to his left, with a notebook. Daniel stood up. He spoke quietly. He said that today they were neither debtors nor supplicants. Today, they were contributors. Each of them had put something into this fund: labor, time, trust. He was simply keeping track. Then he began handing out bundles. Each bundle was signed, by Leah's hand, to Torrin. A new damper for the furnace. Olden finished it an hour ago.
wrapped in canvas, heavy, still warm from the forge. Torin took the bundle and looked at it.
Then at Daniel, then at the damper, to Yuna, medicine for mother, a small clay vial, prepared by Mei Lin. Yuna pressed the vial to her chest with both hands. Maris, a receipt for a month's supply of firewood, delivery tomorrow morning. Maris unfolded the paper, read it. Her daughter took her by the hand. Every bundle, every name, every need. Not charity, not a handout, an investment in the people who will get up tomorrow and keep working. Because someone did the math and took care of it. Leah was writing it down. Every bundle, every amount. Her pen scratched in the silence. No one spoke, because everyone was silent for the same reason. Then Ilmer, an 80-year-old herbalist who remembered the days before the guilds. She stood up, small, hunchbacked, eyes clear as a winter sky. She said that in 80 years she had seen many merchants, greedy ones, cunning ones, kind, foolish, but she had never seen one who handed out bundles with names on them. She said she didn't know who Daniel So really was, but she knew he was the first person in 80 years to bring Little Harbor together around a single table. Then she sat down. Daniel stood there, not knowing what to do with his hands. Ariel next to him stared at the table. Sivan by the door stared at him, without taking her eyes off him. Mei Lin quietly poured him some tea, bitter green tea. He drank it. His hands didn't shake, but something inside was trembling. When everyone had left, Leah closed the door. She turned to Daniel. She said she knew he wasn't Dane. Daniel froze. Leah continued. She said she'd known for a long time, from the very first day. Dane had never hugged her like that. Dane had never looked at the receipt and smirked. Dane was afraid of the collectors. But this man had placed the bar of gold on the table and spoken as if the world belonged to him. She didn't know who he was, didn't know where he was from, didn't know how. But she knew one thing. Dane had loved her. And so did this man. In a different way, but he did too. And that's enough. Daniel stood there, unable to speak. The stone in his chest that he'd been carrying for 6 months suddenly didn't feel any lighter, but it felt warmer. Leah walked over to him, took his hand, said that he was still her brother, because a brother isn't about blood. A brother is the one who stays. Daniel squeezed her hand, tightly. He said he would stay. Leah nodded. Then she let go of his hand and went upstairs. Halfway up, she turned around. She said they had a lot of work tomorrow, and that the notebook was almost finished. They needed a new one. The order of pure measure arrived at the beginning of the 7th month. 2 men in gray cloaks with scales on their chests. Not gold like the Haldor appraisers. Silver, heavy, real. They entered the shop in silence. One was old. His face was like cracked stone. The other was young. Thin lips and eyes that looked at the world as if it were a suspect. The elder introduced himself as Inquisitor Dom. He said that the Order of Pure Measure had received a complaint about gold of dubious origin in circulation at the Small Harbor Accounting Chamber. The complaint required an investigation. Daniel knew the complaint came from the Haldors. They hadn't resorted to economic pressure. They'd gone higher up. The Order of Pure Measure was a religious tribunal. They didn't answer to the guilds. They were not subordinate to the city council. They were not even directly subordinate to the imperial court. Their sole function was the purity of gold. They determined the authenticity of the metal, its history, its journey from the mine to the purse. The inquisitors carried scales, which, according to legend, could distinguish real gold from counterfeit with a single touch. Daniel didn't know if it was a legend or the truth, but he knew that his bars from the safe were impeccably pure. Too pure, without impurities, without traces of smelting. No history. If an inquisitor took such a bar in his hands and sensed that it had no past, Daniel would be burned at the stake, literally. Dom requested access to all of the chamber's financial documents. Daniel granted it. Leah brought out 3 notebooks: the main ledger, caravan records, the register of depositors. Dom read slowly. His young companion walked around the counter and touched the goods. He weighed the sacks in his hands. He sniffed the flour. He tasted the grain. He was looking for traces of magic, traces of an anomaly, traces of something wrong. Daniel stood behind the counter and controlled his breathing. 4 seconds in, 4 seconds out. A technique he'd used before closing out major positions in New York. Dane's body wasn't cooperating. His hands wanted to shake. He wouldn't let them. Dom finished reading. He said the records were flawless. But records are just paper. The paper says the gold came from wholesaler Graham, from caravan trade, from the sale of garments. He wants to see the gold itself. Daniel pulled a box from under the counter. Coins lay inside, all stamped, all with a history, all having passed through dozens of hands. Not a single pure ingot. He'd taken care of that months ago. Every ingot from the vault had passed through Graham or through caravan trade. It received a hallmark. It received a history. It became real. Dom took a coin. He placed it on his scales. The silver pans tilted. They stopped, even. Dom took a second, a third, a 10th. Each time the scales showed the same thing: pure metal, with a history, with a mark, real. The young inquisitor approached and looked over the senior's shoulder. Dom packed up the scales, put them in his bag. He said that no violations had been found at this time, but the case remains open. The Order will be watching. They left. Leah sat down in a chair and rested her head on the table. Ariel cursed, quietly, through clenched teeth. Barrow brought water. Daniel drank a glass. His hands finally began to tremble. He hid them under the table. Mei Lin arrived an hour later. She already knew. At Little Harbor, news traveled faster than pigeons. She brought tea. Not bitter green tea, warm herbal tea with honey. She said this tea was for those who had just gone through something terrible and survived. Daniel drank it and, for the first time in 7 months, allowed himself to speak aloud. He said he was tired. Mei Lin didn't reply. She just poured him another cup. 2 days after the Inquisitor's visit, Daniel received a note. No signature, no seal. 3 words. We know the source. He read it, burned it over a candle, sat down at the table and thought for an hour. The Haldors. They suspected. Didn't know for sure, but they suspected. The endless vein they found 3 years ago in the mountains. An artifact. Similar to his safe. They knew such things existed, and if a source of pure gold with no history had appeared in Viencourt, that meant there was a second artifact somewhere. And its bearer. Daniel realized that the time for peaceful construction was coming to an end. The Haldors would stop applying economic pressure and move on to a direct hunt. They didn't want his business. They wanted him. His safe. He stood up. He walked to the window. Little Harbor was going about its evening life. Torn was carrying out unsold bread. Yuna was carrying a bundle of cloth. Children were running around. It smelled of smoke and soup. These people didn't know that their quiet neighborhood was in the line of fire. That Daniel pulled gold out of thin air every morning. That the most powerful guild on the mainland was hunting him. That the Inquisitors would return. He turned to Ariel. She was standing behind him. She had also read the note before he burned it. She said they needed to hurry. The trial of the scales. The only way to stop the Haldors publicly. Daniel nodded. The trial of the scales, an ancient ritual of Orlon. When one side accuses the other of impure gold, both sides place their gold on the ritual scales in the main temple. The scales reveal the truth, not about the purity of the metal, about the purity of their intentions. A legend, a fairy tale, or maybe not. Daniel didn't know. But he knew one thing. He had the documents, thousands of receipts, hundreds of names, months of work. His gold had a history, the history of every person in Little Harbor, and the Haldor's gold, their endless vein, their broken artifact, their impure ingots that they dumped on the market, destroying the savings of an entire continent. This gold had a history too, only they were hiding it. Daniel told Ariel they needed proof. Proof of the endless vein, proof of the artifact, proof of how the Haldors had manipulated the market. Ariel smiled. She said she had something. She had been waiting for the right moment. She pulled an envelope from the lining of her men's jacket. Thin, old. It contained letters, 3 letters, from the Haldor's former mine manager. The man who, 3 years ago, discovered that the vein wasn't natural, that a mechanism had been found in the mountains, ancient, mysterious, producing gold. The manager wrote these letters to his friend, Ariel's father, a week before the Haldors ruined the Ven's home, a week before the manager disappeared. Ariel had kept these letters for 3 years. She waited. Daniel read them and felt the puzzle coming together. 2 artifacts, one broken in the Haldor's possession, one intact in his. 2 halves of a single mechanism, left behind by a civilization that perished from the same disease, from the belief that infinite gold equals infinite power. He placed the letters on the table. He looked at Ariel. She was looking at him. For the first time, without a wall in her eyes. He said it was time. She nodded. Preparing for the trial of the scales took 3 weeks. Daniel worked 20 hours a day. Ariel slept even less. They gathered documents, receipts, evidence, testimonies. Leah copied every sheet onto clean paper. Her handwriting became their main weapon. Clear, steady, irrefutable. 1,412 receipts, each for a single coin, each with a name, a date, a signature. Received, issued, returned. The human story of every copper coin that passed through the chamber. Daniel filed a petition for a trial of the scales through the city clerk's office. Formally, any citizen of Viencourt had the right to demand a trial if they believed that tainted gold was being used against them. The Chancellery accepted the petition. 2 days later, a response arrived from the Haldors. Cassius accepted the challenge. He could not refuse. Refusal of a trial by scales in Orlon was tantamount to an admission of guilt. Date: the first day of the 9th month. The main temple of Viencourt, the Hall of Ritual Scales. 3 weeks. Daniel used every hour. He sent Savon to the northern border with a sealed envelope for one person. The former assistant to the manager of the Haldor mines, the only witness who could confirm the contents of Ariel's letters. Savon traveled for 4 days. She found the man. He was living in a village under a false name. Old, sick, frightened. Savon told him that Ariel Venz was alive, that she had letters, that there would be a trial. The old man was silent for a day. Then he agreed. Savon brought him to Viencourt 2 days before the trial. His name was Ulmer. He had been in hiding for 3 years. 3 years of waking up at night in a sweat. 3 years of waiting for them to come for him. Daniel put him in the back room of the shop. Maylin gave him tea, warm, herbal, with honey, for those who are afraid. Ulmer drank and told his story. About the mine, about the discovery. About the mechanism in the rock that they first mistook for an altar. About how the mechanism began to produce ingots, irregularly, with impurities, sometimes 10 a day, sometimes 100, sometimes nothing for weeks. The Haldors tried to fix it. They couldn't. They decided to use it as is. They dumped gold onto the market. They drove prices down. They bought up the bankrupts. The Great Devaluation didn't start because of greed, because of a broken mechanism and greed. Daniel was taking notes. Leah was taking notes. Ariel sat across from Ulmer and didn't blink. She listened as her father's world crumbled, word by word, number by number, fact by fact. When Ulmer finished, she stood up. She walked out silently. She returned 10 minutes later. Her eyes were dry. Her back was straight. She said she was ready. Judgment Day. Daniel woke up before dawn. Leah was already awake. She was sitting at the table, rereading the notebook. All 1,412 receipts. She looked up when he came downstairs. She said everything was in order, not a single mistake. Daniel nodded. He knew. Leah never made mistakes. They walked to the temple as a team, Daniel in front, in a blue shirt from Yuna, with the notebook under his arm. Ariel on the right, in her men's suit, with letters in her inside pocket. Leah on the left, with a quill behind her ear. Mei Lin behind them. Yuna, Toran, Maris, Alden, Ham, Tosh, Ridden, Kara, Ilmer, everyone. Savan brought up the rear, 2 swords at her belt, eyes on every alleyway. The Viancourt Temple stood in the center of the city, stone, ancient, huge doors of black wood. The Hall of Ritual Scales was circular, a high dome with windows through which the morning light streamed. In the center, the scales, not ordinary ones, ritual scales. 2 bowls of white metal, each the size of a table. Chains ran upward to a beam that no one had ever changed. It was as old as the temple itself. The benches along the walls were filled. All of Viancourt had come to watch. Merchants, artisans, officials, ordinary townspeople. Daniel saw their faces: curiosity, fear, hope, anger. Cassius was already there. He stood by the right-hand scale. 4 assistants stood beside him. Behind them were porters carrying chests. The gold of the Haldo, ingots from an endless vein. Cassius was calm, not a trace of nervousness. He looked at Daniel as if he were a student who had come to take an exam he wasn't yet ready for. The priest-weigher stepped up to the scales, an old man in white robes. His voice was quiet but audible in every corner of the hall. He announced the weighing trial between the Halder Guild and the small harbor accounting chamber. Both sides placed their gold on the pans. The scales revealed the truth. Cassius nodded to his assistants. They opened the chests. Gold bars were placed in the right pan one after another, heavy, shiny. The pan sank with a dull clang. The hall fell silent. There was a lot of gold, a great deal. The priest turned to Daniel. It was his turn. Daniel stepped up to the left pan. In his hands, he held a notebook. Not gold, a notebook. The hall buzzed. Cassius frowned. The priest raised his hand, demanding silence. Daniel placed the notebook on the pan. 1,412 receipts. 1,412 names. 1,412 stories. A small letter Y on the hem. A new damper for the stove. Medicine for someone else's mother. Firewood for a month. The first paycheck paid on time. A contract with a pension clause. Every penny recorded by the hand of a 16-year-old girl who never made a mistake. The priest wanted to object. It was against the rules. Gold is placed on the scales, not paper. But the scales wavered. The left pan with the notebook tilted and slowly began to sink. The hall fell silent. The silence was so complete that you could hear a person breathing in the back row. The pan with the notebook outweighed the pan with the hall door bars. Cassius closed his eyes. For a second. 2. He opened them. His face hadn't changed, but something in his eyes had gone out. Not anger, not pride, confidence. Daniel turned to face the hall. He took the letters out of his pocket. 3 letters from the mine manager. He spoke softly, so softly that the people in the back rows leaned forward. He said that his gold had a history, the history of every person in this hall and beyond its walls, of every receipt, every bundle, every return. And the Haldor's gold has a history too, only they hide it. He read key passages from the letters, about the discovery in the mountains, about the mechanism, about the unstable ingots, about the 3 years of manipulation that led to the Great Devaluation. Omer rose from his bench, old, shaky, but alive. He confirmed every word. The hall erupted, not in shouts, in a rumble, like a beehive that had been awakened. Cassius stood by his bowl. His assistants exchanged glances. The guards tensed. Sivan placed her hand on the hilt of her sword, just in case. Then she withdrew it. No longer necessary. Daniel looked at Cassius. Cassius looked at him. Between them stood a set of scales. On one pan, the gold that had drowned the mainland. On the other, the notebook that had lifted it. Daniel spoke his final words. He said that gold is worth nothing without people, and he asked for it to be recorded in the minutes. The priest recorded it. After the trial of the scales, everything changed. Not quickly, not overnight, but inevitably, like a river that had found a new course. The Viencourt City Council launched an investigation into the activities of the Haldor Guild. The 3 other guilds, which had remained silent for 3 years, suddenly found their voices. Daniel's documents and Omer's testimony became the basis for a review of all trade agreements from the past 3 years. The Great Devaluation did not stop in a single day. But for the first time, people understood why it had begun and who was to blame. Cassius Haldor did not flee. He did not go into hiding. He did not deny it. A week after the trial, he appeared before the city council voluntarily. He handed over the documents regarding the endless vein. He agreed to an audit. Daniel found out about this from Ariel. She came into the shop with the look of someone who couldn't decide what she was feeling. She said she'd hated the Haldors for 3 years, and now their leader was giving himself up, and she didn't know what to do about it. Daniel replied that hatred is a debt that needs to be paid off, just like any other. Ariel looked at him for a long time. Then she said he was unbearable, and that she was glad he was unbearable. The chamber was growing. After the trial, 23 trading houses joined it in a single week. Then another 15. Then the craft workshops. Then the first caravan drivers from other routes who had heard about insurance and fixed prices. Daniel understood that the chamber had outgrown Little Harbor. It needed a new status, a new name, a new building. The People's Bank of Viencourt. He spoke these words for the first time at a meeting of the chamber's council. 12 people at the table. Torin, Olden, Tosh, Ridden, Kara, Ilmer. 6 more newcomers. Leah with a notebook. Ariel with a pencil behind her ear. Mei Lin with a teapot. Savon by the door. The People's Bank of Viencourt. Not a guild, not a trading house. A bank. A place where money is not metal but a document. Not a threat but a promise. Not the property of a single family, but a tool for everyone. Tosh asked who would be in charge. Daniel replied that it would be the board, elected, from among the depositors, every year. Ridden asked, what about Daniel? What position did he hold? Daniel replied that he held none. He's a merchant, from a stall at Small Harbor. If the board needs his advice, he'll be there. If not, he'll be selling lentils. Ariel snorted. She said he was mocking them. Daniel replied that he wasn't. The bank should belong to the people, not to him. If the bank depends on a single person, it's not a bank. It's a cult of personality, and cults crumble when the personality leaves. Ariel wanted to object. She looked him in the eyes. She didn't object. A month after the trial, Daniel received an invitation to the palace, not from Cassius, from the imperial household. The emperor's third daughter had requested an audience, Princess Heian. Daniel arrived at the palace wearing the same blue shirt from Yuna. The guard at the gate looked at him as if he were a mistake, but she let him through. The princess was waiting for him in the library, a huge room with shelves reaching the ceiling, the smell of old paper and leather. Heian sat at a table piled high with scrolls. Young, 21 years old, dark hair, quiet eyes, hands stained with ink. She raised her head and looked at Daniel. Then she said she had read the Court of Balance's protocol 6 times and that she had questions. Daniel sat down across from her. She began to ask, not about gold, not about the hall doors, about the system, about promissory notes, about insurance, about warehouse receipts, about double-entry bookkeeping, about futures. She spoke these words like someone who had read about them in old books, but had never seen them in real life. Daniel answered. He explained. He drew diagrams on paper. Heian listened so intently that for a second Daniel forgot where he was. 2 hours later, she leaned back in her chair and said he wasn't who he claimed to be. Daniel froze. She continued. She said that a merchant from Little Harbor couldn't possibly know concepts described in only 3 books, 2 of which are kept in this library, and the third was lost 200 years ago. She asked who he was. Daniel was silent for 10 seconds. Then he told the truth. Not all of it, but enough. He said he had come from far away, that he knew things that hadn't yet been invented here, that he couldn't explain how, but that his goal was neither power nor gold. His goal was a world where people didn't have to fear tomorrow. Heian looked at him. Then she nodded. She said she believed him, not because he was convincing, but because a man who wants power doesn't give up a position at his own bank. She stood up, walked over to the shelf, took out a scroll, unrolled it. Daniel saw a map, an old one, a detailed one, all of Orlan's trade routes, all the guilds, all the exchange points. Heian said she was working on a project, a unified system of measurement and credit for the entire continent. She'd been working on it for 5 years, alone, because no one at court considered it important, and because she was the third daughter and her opinion carried no weight. Daniel looked at the map, at the notes made in her handwriting, at the calculations in the margins. It was close to what he himself had planned, very close. He said her project should become law. Heian smiled wryly. She said that laws are written by those who have power. She has only a library. Daniel replied that he has a bank, and that a bank with a library is more than a sword with a crown. Heian looked at him. For the first time during the entire conversation, she smiled. Not politely, genuinely. They worked until evening, together, on a project that, in a year and a half, would become the Viencourt Concordat, the first agreement in Orlan's history on a unified system of credit and insurance measures. Princess Heian would be listed as the official author of the document. Daniel insisted. She refused. He insisted again. She said he was unbearable. The second person in a month to tell him that. Daniel thought it was a good sign. By the end of the year, the Viencourt People's Bank had become a reality. The first branch in the second city opened under the sign So and Vens. Ariel stood in front of the sign and remained silent for 10 minutes. Daniel stood beside her. He didn't rush her. Some things need to be experienced in silence. Savan was promoted to senior security guard for the caravan service. 12 people worked under her, all on contracts, all with pensions, all with family benefits. She still ate at the communal table, not in the corner, at the table. Mei Lin ran a microloan network across 4 districts. Her borrowers paid back the money. Not all of them, but most, because they were ashamed in front of their neighbors, because the system worked, because Mei Lin had finally stopped trying to save everyone on her own. Yuna sewed. Her dresses, labeled Yu, were worn by merchants' wives all over Viencourt. She hired 2 apprentices. She no longer blushed at the word price. Toran baked bread, the best in Little Wharf. He was no longer afraid of the morning. Barrow kept a diary. The oddities of the young master. The latest entry. Number 123. Today he said that time is money. I thought 3 days. He's right. But now I'm afraid to look at the clock. Leah kept the main ledger for the Viencourt People's Bank. Her signature carried as much weight as the director's. Her name was written on the cover of the ledger, in her handwriting, which her mother had taught her. That night, after the second branch opened, Daniel sat alone in the shop. Little Pierre was asleep. A candle was burning. An old notebook lay on the table. The first one, worn, with a cheap leather cover. The very one with which it all began. He opened it. Clumsy columns, neat numbers, not a single mistake. The handwriting of a 16-year-old girl who kept the records not because she knew how, but because there was no one else to do it. Daniel closed the notebook. He placed his palm on the cover. He closed his eyes and saw the kitchen in Queens. His mother was sitting at the table. A white mug with a crack. Tea. She looked up and gazed at him. She said he'd finally stopped rushing. That she was glad. Daniel opened his eyes. The candle was burning down. He knew he wouldn't be coming back. He'd known from the first day. He knew when the lentil dug into his cheek. He knew when Leah cried over him. He knew when Cassius offered a partnership. He knew when the scales tipped. He wouldn't be going home. He wouldn't call his mother.